All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I'm Chris Didle. I am your host for This is CDR today and always. Really, really excited to have everybody back for this week's session. This is a really exciting one that kind of materialized kind of quickly in response to an amazing article by Paul Gambill, a really thought-provoking one that stirred a lot of sort of interesting discussion on LinkedIn and other places. So we thought we'd have Paul join us today to kind of break down in a little bit more depth the main points he was trying to get across in that article, which I thought he got across quite effectively, and then to really have a conversation with you all about what's discussed. We're going to do it a little bit differently this week, where there is a presentation that Paul will put forward. It'll be about 15 minutes, and then we will go ahead and rather than me doing my normal 20 minutes of moderator questions, I might ask one question, but I know there's going to be a lot of sort of thoughts or comments or questions that you all in the audience are going to want to sort of share. So please do use the comment panel on the side, drop your questions, your sort of comments, and then Tank, my co-host, you'll meet in a second. We're just going to pull those into the conversation actually, kind of from the get-go. So definitely do be prepared to share your thoughts. So this should be a really, really fun conversation. Before we get started, and I hand over to Tank to introduce Paul, just a little bit about Open Air. If you're new to what Open Air is, we're a all-volunteer global network of CDR enthusiasts, started back in 2018. And our members work in a variety of different action areas, very, very involved in policy advocacy around CDR, particularly at the subnational or state level. Have some amazing and very fun citizen science and R&D projects that members work on. We do education programming like what you're watching right now. Certainly This is CDR, sort of a flagship initiative in our education column. And then occasionally we directly support the development of new CDR enterprises or assist existing ones. So if you want to find out more about that, please do join us. Tank will drop the link to our Discord and be a part of our community. So we're going to go ahead and move forward right now with our guest today, who's Paul Gambill, and I'm going to bring up my buddy and partner in crime, Tank Chen, to introduce Paul.
Hi, everyone. Well, we have audience from all over the world today. That's very exciting. Yes, we're excited to welcome Paul Gambill. Paul is an entrepreneur and system thinker focused on accelerating climate solution through better market design. He is the founder and former CEO of Nori, one of the first carbon removal marketplaces, and has been working in carbon removal space since 2015. With a background in software engineering and community organizing, Paul brings cross-disciplinary approach to addressing complex challenges, often bridging the worlds of technology, policy, and sustainability. His writing on Inevitable and Obvious explores the intersection of climate innovation and system changes, sparkling dialogues across the carbon removal community and beyond. So we're very excited to have Paul here today, and we'll be taking questions after Paul's presentation as well. So Paul, whenever you're ready.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Tank. Thank you, Chris. Hello, everybody. As you said, my name is Paul Gambill. In 2015, I got interested in carbon removal because I was wondering why we couldn't just take the carbon back out of the air and solve climate change. I was kind of sick of hearing about climate change, and I just kind of wanted it to go away. And it seemed straightforward to me that what we have facing us is an engineering problem. We have to move the carbon. And so in 2015, I founded a meetup group in Seattle, where I'm still based, and used that to find people who were interested in learning about this, because at the time there was really nothing. There were a handful of research centers at universities around the world, and there were single-digit carbon removal startups. So it was mostly the direct air capture companies, Climeworks being the most successful of them today. And of course there were efforts for biochar and other things going on, but carbon removal when I started didn't even have the phrase carbon removal. It was always carbon capture and storage. And so I I'm sharing that to say, like, I've watched the industry go from non-existent to where we are today, and I'm concerned. And so briefly, I co-founded and led Nori, which we started in 2017. Nori was meant to be a marketplace that would help build the infrastructure for carbon removal. So all of the awesome different methods for carbon removal that are out there today, we wanted to be kind of the central space that would help connect buyers and suppliers. And we wanted to integrate carbon removal into the background of everyday life. And I'll talk more about that as I get to sort of advice for what we might do going forward. But I wrote a couple articles recently, as Chris and Tank mentioned, and so I'm going to kind of recap some of the arguments that I was making in that, because I want to help you understand why I think this is such a crisis at this moment, and why it's not as simple as just kind of continuing on the path forward. Because if we don't make any changes, I am very certain that we are not going to reach gigaton scale anywhere near the timeline that we need to in order to avoid the worst problems from climate change. So this is a chart that came out of a report that the Rocky Mountain Institute put together that was commissioned by the Bezos Earth Fund. And it's a really good framing mechanism, I think, because if we imagine working backwards from, we're trying to get to 10 billion tons of removal per year by 2050, then like no industry is capable of scaling from 0 to 10 billion tons like overnight. Like, it takes time to build that up. There are a lot of different components that go into this. And I'm going to keep harping on this message, but this is a systems problem. There's a lot of complexity to how you are actually going to get to 10 billion tons. You need enormous amounts of capital. You need political buy-in. You need cultural narrative pushing it. You need financial infrastructure. You need all of the different technologies and nature-based solutions that are going into this. You need a venture capital supporting that. You need capital solutions like growth equity that support the later stages of advancement of that. You need to see companies that are doing this going public and financing through that. So technologies typically go through deployments over a lifetime on an S-curve like this. And so if we work backwards, we can see that even from where we are today in 2025, like, we are nowhere near the 285 million tons per year that we need to be capable of doing by 2030. So we have to right the ship now. It's sort of like when you're younger and people are telling you the importance of compound interest when you start saving for retirement as a young person. Like, this is the same thing. Like, we have to get this going now, because every week, month, year of delay on scale that we have right now, we push that end point further and further out, and we risk hitting more and worse tipping points in climate change. So I really believe this needs to be an all hands on deck emergency at the moment. And so the reality of where we are today is we're doing hundreds of thousands of tons, potentially larger if you take into account various different types of land use change. I've seen estimates actually up to several gigatons, but it's really hard to tell exactly how much of that is happening. And the other factor here is there are a lot of different carbon removal companies that are in business right now and are in a difficult spot when it comes to financing, to say the least. And I'm saying that as a founder of a company that was around for 7 years. We raised $20 million. We accounted for hundreds of thousands of tons removed. And, as far as I'm concerned, we were hitting every KPI that we were trying to, and we weren't able to find new financing, and we ran out of cash and had to shut down. And that's not going to be the last case of something like that. So there's this great scene in Apollo 13. If you recall, actually two great scenes in that movie that I reference often. But when they're considering like how much energy, how much battery power they have to be able to get them back after slingshotting around the moon, you can see in that top image, like they're going to run out there. And Gene Kranz, the mission flight director, he has this really cool scene. He's making a really strong point to all of his engineers there. Like, failure is not an option. And the same thing is true here with carbon removal. Failure is not an option. I've actually been spending the last several months doing a deep dive personally, researching various different geoengineering methods, global cooling methods like SRM and SAI, ice sheet preservation, coral reef bleaching protection, methane stuff. And the unfortunate conclusion that I have come to is none of it really matters if we don't do large scale carbon removal as well. So we have to get to large scale very quickly. It is not optional to fail in this. And as I mentioned, there are an enormous number of startups, which is great. This is really good. None of this existed when I began in 2015. So I'm really excited to see this. But in order to have this many companies moving forward, you need to have a system that supports it. And the problem is that right now we have what's called a monopsony. So a monopoly is when you have one entity that is kind of controlling everything on the selling side. So there's only one company that's providing all the services. A monopsony is on the other side. So when you really only have one buyer or a handful of buyers who are purchasing everything. And that's the case that we have today with Microsoft. Now, I think Microsoft are being fantastic leaders in this space. So this is not critical of Microsoft in any way, shape, or form. And I'm also very pleased with the way that they take a multivariate approach towards what they purchase. So I don't think that Microsoft is doing anything bad, but this is more zoomed out from as a system, we collectively have a problem when there is only one buyer buying the most of everything. And so if you are a carbon removal startup that is trying to sell carbon removal credit offsets, and you are one of the lucky few who is able to sell to Microsoft, congratulations. I'm thrilled for you. That's really great. And that means that you're going to survive at least for another year or two. But if you are not one of those companies, then you are facing a very tough uphill battle. And that is a problem. So I believe, and I published 2 articles. One of them I co-published with Nick Van Osdol in the Keep Cool newsletter, which I highly recommend to anyone if you're not subscribed on that. And in it, we identified 3 major barriers to scaling. So first is on precision measurement. And I want to be clear, I am not advocating for getting rid of MRV. I'm just saying that I think that we have over-optimized on precision for preserving the reputational liability of corporate buyers. And perhaps that's not the best way to scale. The second is our obsession with permanence. And again, that comes back to there are reasons for this. That's because corporate buyers are looking for that. And I think that's fine. But permanent removal methods are not the only ways to get to the scale that we need. And then the last is additionality. This has been a sort of bugbear for me for many, many, many years. I think this is a holdover from the legacy carbon offsets market, and I think that it is very much getting in the way of scaling removal. And I'll go through each of these in detail next. So on measurement precision. In the Carbon Removal's Wrong Turn article, I talked about how one of the things that we saw at Nori, and I was tagged in a LinkedIn post about this morning, and so maybe I'll sort of respond to that right now. One of the things that we saw at Nori was, we were doing regenerative agriculture, and when we started, we had to build out our whole methodology for how we did measurement and verification. We had to find a partner, so we went to Colorado State University. We talked to the team who built Comet Farm. This was in 2018. And they ended up spinning out a private for-profit business called Soil Metrics, which was eventually acquired by Indigo Ag. And they more or less provided an API to us. And they were building off of a model or models provided by the US government called DayCent. And the way that it works essentially is they've got 1,200 different sites around the United States that they are doing regular soil sample testing in a controlled environment. And then on top of that, they collect cropping practice data from farmers and then can essentially model basically, if you changed to regen ag practices, this is how much carbon you are putting in the ground relative to what would have happened if you had just continued with conventional practices on the same fields. Now, we found, especially back in 2019, 2020, and 2021, that if you were to add the need for soil sample testing into that methodology, the unit economics just would not work out. We were selling at $20 and eventually $25 per ton. And the farmers were taking like say 20 of the 25, and then Nori's taking 5 in the end of that. And if we were to incorporate soil sample testing, we'd have to be selling somewhere around $35 a ton just to break even. So, and the market was not really willing to bear that. And I'll talk about that issue a little bit later on. So this comes from a need that corporate sustainability buyers have in order to prove that what they're doing is viable. Because, I mean, the problem that they're trying to solve is real. And I have a lot of sympathy for CSOs. The legacy carbon offsets market has been full of fraud. And there has been a lot of funny business and a lot of reports in the news that have really dragged the reputations of large companies through the mud. And so if you are a CSO, you're facing this really interesting problem. Well, I have a slide about that, so I'll talk. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but there was an instance we had one time at Nori where there was a very large buyer who everyone here knows that we were talking to and they had bought soil carbon credits before. And they said to us that they would be very interested in buying from Nori at scale, but only if we had soil sample testing. And the reasoning for that given was because that would help them feel more comfortable or confident that what we were saying was accurate. But from a purely science perspective, that wasn't really necessary because we were just building uncertainty and error calculations into our methodology and discounting. So I say this because there are plenty of scalable methods of carbon removal, like ocean-based approaches, enhanced weathering, or soil that need to rely on modeling. But the way that we've built the market for what buyers are looking for today, it makes it really difficult to fit those in. And it's hard for them to take that risk on making that purchase. So there is like a cultural narrative thing here that I'm trying to address, and to say, like, measurement is good and important, but we should also be comfortable with building in uncertainty and discounting the number of credits issued, and then moving forward on that. Because if we're not going to put money into these more scalable methods, we're never going to reach that 285 million number, let alone 10 billion number. Now, permanence. This is another hot topic, and you know, I am obviously biased coming from the perspective at Nori, where we were dealing mostly for almost the entirety of our operating history, dealing with more short-term, fast cycle carbon removal. And I think permanence is great. Like it is a good thing to say that we want to take the carbon out and just not have to deal with it anymore. The problem is the ways to do that today are not ready for scale. And the ways that we can get more carbon out for a shorter period of time today are ready to scale. And scale is the most important thing, in my opinion. Now, why do we have this situation? Because going back to 2019, and again, I don't want to fault anyone for doing this because everyone is acting very rationally. And I'm also quite grateful for the way that Stripe led the way in establishing that carbon removal is something distinctly different from carbon avoidance and carbon offsetting. But what happened was in 2019, when Stripe announced their carbon removal initiative, they had, I think it was $1 million that they'd pay any price per ton in order to be catalytic for carbon removal. And they put out an RFP. And a lot of different companies, including Nori, submitted to that RFP. And they had an advisory board of scientists. Some, maybe, I can't actually see who's attending right now, but maybe some of you are in the audience right now. And the recommendation made was that if you are going to be offsetting your emissions that are created from fossil fuels, then you should be offsetting in the form of long-term permanent storage or removal. This makes all the sense in the world. It's the like for like concept. So if you're going to emit carbon and it's going to go up in the atmosphere and it's going to hang around for potentially 1,000 years and having a continued warming effect, then if you're going to, from an accounting perspective, remove that carbon and store it, you should do it for 1,000 years or more. That makes sense. The problem is that became the sort of norm and the only accepted way. There's like a gravitational pull that Stripe and eventually Frontier, and then Microsoft and Shopify jumped in there, and now we've got some of the other tech companies in there as well. That there's a gravitational pull towards saying that like this is the only way to do this, and I just really don't think it is. And there are different ways that you can address this kind of thing from a carbon accounting perspective. Like I would point people to the E-Liabilities Institute as an organization that has put forward what I think is actually a really good plan for doing that. But just even consider the idea that you could have renewals of more short-term carbon storage. The reason I bring this up is because, again, we are facing tipping points this century where we are going to see large-scale destabilization of ice sheets. We're going to see coral reef bleaching. We are going to see large-scale methane release. And I would so much rather deal with, I would so much rather remove large amounts of carbon today, even if we have to continually renew that over time, because it buys us more time. Like we've all seen the technology growth curves of like solar panels, for instance, and how they've come down in cost and how they have scaled up in capability. And that's going to continue happening with carbon removal. Like this is going to come down in cost to do more permanent removals, but we need to buy ourselves time. And I totally understand the desire to be like catalytic, but I think that at this point we've got too much catalyzing of permanent and not enough focus on large scale scaling. Because we should be removing as much carbon as we can and then continuing to scale things up. So think about it like, if we were playing a game of like SimCity or some sort of strategy game, you would be thinking about how many of your resources you're dedicating to like R&D. So think of that as like the permanent stuff versus like what you can do today versus other things around like mitigation. So if we're looking at climate change from that perspective, we should be putting an enormous amount of resources into what we can remove today, and then a large amount, but smaller, relatively speaking, because we have to add them to 100% on more permanent stuff, and then gradually shift that over time so that we are doing more and more permanent removals in the future after we have dealt with the more immediate crisis of there's just way too much carbon in the air today. Additionality is another thing that at Nori we went pretty hard on this one. And briefly, I just want to say that like additionality sort of makes sense to me as an important thing for legacy carbon offsetting. So if you are a buyer 10, 15 years ago buying carbon offsets, what you're doing is you're paying someone else to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that they are still emitting. So they're emitting X amount, and you're paying them for reducing those emissions by some amount, but they're still emitting new emissions. And so if you, as the buyer of those carbon credits, those offsets, wants to be able to make some sort of claim about how you're reducing emissions, you need to know that that carbon is getting reduced, and it wouldn't have happened otherwise. Unfortunately, that introduces some very difficult to prove counterfactuals. And that also has resulted in a lot of fraud. I mean, this was a topic that we were talking about with my co-founders when we were starting Nori in 2017. Like, it's no different today. And so we went to great effort at Nori to distinguish between financial additionality and baseline additionality. Now, baseline additionality for removals is contextually saying, we establish a baseline and how much carbon was removed relative to that baseline. So starting from point time t going forward, how much carbon was removed relative to where it was. We built that into our croplands methodology, and then it becomes much more straightforward. So things like a direct air capture project is very measurable and straightforward to prove the baseline additionality. Now, financial additionality is something that is very difficult, especially on the soil carbon side. And I keep coming back to this because this is what we were experiencing. Farmers are not switching to regenerative ag because of the carbon payments. The carbon payments that they are able to get today, $15, $20, $30 a ton, are not sufficient to offset the cost of buying new cover crop seed, buying new equipment for how they're going to get that cover cropping, potentially giving up crop insurance from the federal government. There are other savings that they get, but it is not sufficient. And when we were operating, I was always asking farmers, my number one question is, what do you think, how much do you need to be earning in order for your neighbor to want to adopt these practices too? And they would usually say something around $100 per ton. Now, the problem with that is, zooming back out from a systems perspective, Nori found ourselves in this weird no man's land of price segmentation, where we were trying to sell to different, so the customers that are out there were some companies that were trying to buy carbon credits, but they're trying to buy as cheaply as they can. So they were usually looking at something like $3 to $5 per ton, and they'd be interested in like maybe a cheap like forest preservation credit or a renewable energy credit or something like that. So $3 to $5. And then on the other end of the scale, you've got like $100 to $1,000 per ton from buyers who are looking for the more permanent, durable removals. And then we found ourselves in the middle at $25 a ton for nature-based carbon. And there wasn't really much of a market for that. I think that there's like a bit of an education issue there, into the last two scaling barriers I just went over. But we would go to the buyers who buy the cheap credits, and we're like the premium product, but then we'd go to the buyers of the permanent stuff, and we're like the not as good product. And that's a real issue. And one of the reasons for that is because we were never able to get certified or verified by like ICROA or any some of the standard recommendations from ICBCM and that kind of thing. The ratings agencies were not willing to certify what we were doing because it wasn't financially additional. Regenerative agriculture is never going to be financially additional. And so if we want regen ag to be a large part of the solution for pulling down carbon, which we should all want, then we have to rethink this. The other thing I will posit for this is, additionality is coming for every one of you eventually. Because if you are let's say you're a DAC company, like at some point in the future, like your operations are going to be cash flow positive. Like you're going to have ways of making money beyond just removing and mineralizing the carbon. At that point, you're no longer financially additional. So from my perspective, we should all understand that 10, 20, 30 years from now, like everyone working in this space is going to be doing it because beyond just the financial additionality test reasons, no one's going to be additional anymore. Are we just going to shut the whole industry down? Of course not. So we should pull that same understanding to today and look at it like we don't need financial additionality for carbon removal. The simple fact is, if you are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, you should get paid for doing so, period, end of story. So ultimately, the problem that we're trying to solve here, so again, I want to come back to like zooming out. If we're going to get to large scale carbon removal, the question we should be asking ourselves is, who's going to pay for this? I mean, that's really the question for any climate intervention, is who's going to pay for this? And so I have spent many years thinking about this particular challenge of financing it. I mean, that's why Nori had this like cryptocurrency model. I wanted to have our token be the way to create like new forms of finance for this. The current model is that we have sustainability departments at large companies holding up the entire industry. And this is a very fragile situation because, as we have seen, like the current geopolitical landscape is not good for climate tech. We've got economic turmoil in the markets. We've got a cultural pullback from things related to climate sustainability. ESG is like a dirty word now in finance circles. And we're hinging all of our bets on more buyers, more sustainability departments showing up with budget willing to do this. I don't think that they're coming. So the other problem is, if you're a sustainability officer, again, I said earlier, like I have a lot of sympathy for you because you're in a really difficult position. You have a limited budget granted to you by your finance department at your company. And you have a mandate of minimizing your liability risk and trying to get as much precision to what it is so that you are most likely to not get dinged in the press for what you buy. So why would you go forward with this? Like the only way in which many of these companies have done this is because there have been really enterprising individuals. I would argue that there are probably double-digit or less people working at these major companies with budgets who are are entirely responsible for pushing this industry forward from a who pays question. That is way too much pressure on those individuals, and we're not finding more who's coming. So they've got limited budgets. They have a very specific focus. That's what results in this situation where we are prioritizing permanence and additionality and really precise measurement above all else. And so we're missing the forest for the trees. So again, everyone's acting rationally. I think that these CSOs are doing exactly what they should be doing. But as an industry, we need something beyond just CSOs paying for carbon removal. So I'm trying to propose, and this is what we were thinking about at Nori, and I've been thinking about this for a long time. We need to be moving beyond just carbon offsetting as the model, because that's a cost center. We need to be moving along this spectrum. And so in the middle, I'm depicting here like building carbon removals into various things. So I think like what Stripe does with their I don't remember what the program is called, but if you're a Stripe customer, you can opt into like 1% of the fee that you pay goes into the carbon fund. Or if you buy something through Shopify, they're paying for removals that way. And you can opt into that program. That's a great middle step. But what I'm arguing we need to get to is carbon removal as a value generator. There needs to be, like, if we're going to get to the massive scale, it's not going to be on the backs of the Fortune 500 companies. Because do the math. Like, I go through the scope 1 and 2 emissions for all Fortune 500 companies. It's not that big of a number. It's not going to get us to gigaton scale, even if every company is doing that. What we need is carbon removal integrated into literally everything that we do. So I posited some examples in there, and I'm going to be I'm working on a new article to kind of give some more examples on this. But think about I used an example of like you take an Uber ride. This is something that we wanted to do at Nori. You take an Uber ride, and then at the end of the ride, a sponsor pays for removing carbon from your ride, and they play a little ad. So they're getting advertising for their brand, which is a value generator out of that. And Uber is getting the goodwill of facilitating this on their platform, but they're not paying for it, which is a thing that they like. We got a lot of positive feedback when we talked about integrations like this with companies. We talked with, I pitched one time to the head of Apple Pay about integrating carbon removal as like something like this. I know that Virgin is part of the Virgin Red program that you can put money towards carbon removal using your points model. We posited, like a mobile app game that had in-app purchases, like a portion of the purchase goes towards carbon removal, and it's like a game that's focused on carbon removal. There are lots of different ways that we need to be doing this, but we need to be moving beyond just offsetting and selling to big corporate customers, and we need to make it really simple to integrate carbon removal into other stuff, because the metric that I want to propose that everyone needs to be focusing on from now forward is atmospheric impact. What are we doing as an industry that's going to make the most impact on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? That's the thing. That's the phase that I think we're at. And yesterday on LinkedIn, Naeem Merchant and I kind of had a little back and forth about this, and I appreciated the dialogue. And I'm trying to say, so go check that out on LinkedIn. I'm trying to say that it makes sense that as an industry, we've been focusing on selling to corporates and sustainability budgets because that was all that there was. But I think that we're at a new phase where we need to be entering a new landscape. We need new ideas for how we are going to integrate carbon removal into the broader economy in the background, not just like a large offtake agreement. So recommendations that I have: standards bodies. So that's ratings agencies, like ICROA, Corsia, ICBCM, B0, Silvera, whoever. Like, start thinking about how to balance the scaling potential with all of these minutia verification requirements, because right now that is a barrier. It is a huge barrier. And I've talked to many different carbon removal company founders who complain like that. You have to get certified by like 5 different ratings agencies now. And it's like hundreds of pages of paperwork. And you're doing that over and over and over. And it's just a waste of time. And then when you hear from sustainability folks at the buyers, they're like, well, we don't really think that this adds that much value, but it's a box that we have to check in order to get this through. Like, we're wasting our time with this. We need to think about how we fix that. For major buyers, I think what Microsoft does is great. Like develop a larger balanced portfolio, looking at lots of different types of removals, not just things that are permanent. Like scale should be what we're going for. For the infrastructure providers, so this is like marketplaces, aggregators, anyone, brokers, anyone who's facilitating connecting removal to buyers or people who are paying, answering that who pays question. Start thinking about value generation. What are new ways that we can make this more valuable for people that go beyond just offtakes? And then I think that like I've been really excited to see that there's been a lot more conversation developing around this, and I'm really happy to be on this podcast talking to you all about this. And I hope that there's more. I'm going to be in San Francisco for Climate Week, April 23rd. Mass Reforestation is hosting a panel that I'll be on. We're going to be talking about this, so if you're there, come to that. But I think that we need some sort of like the next Carbon Unbound or something. Like we need to have a focus on how do we reset where we are, because I think we've reached diminishing returns for what the industry is doing, and we need to take a new direction. And I think we need, as an industry, to be collectively talking about ways that we can do that. Because lastly, the climate doesn't care about carbon accounting. And carbon accounting is not the end all be all. That's not why we're doing this. We're doing this because we are trying to pull as much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And the only thing that matters is the global ppm metric. So we need to get that down to 350, and that needs to be our North Star. Not just offtake agreements, not just like money spent. Those are sort of leading indicators. But the most important KPI in this entire business is how much carbon are we pulling out of the atmosphere. And in my first article, for if you know programming, like I described using a while loop. Basically, we're never going to get to a point where we've removed enough carbon and we can just say, okay, we're done here. Time to shut the industry down. Once we get a carbon removal industry going, this is going to continue operating forever, because we're never going to get to like fully zero emissions. So basically, think about it this way, if the atmospheric carbon level is above 350 ppm, then you need to remove more carbon, period. And so that's what we need to be building our systems around. And so that's just, there's some links you can find me at. I write at my newsletter, inevitableandobvious.com. My next piece is going to be about category creation in the carbon removal space, how to think about this. If you're working in the space, like some ideas I can share with you. I'd be happy to bounce things off. I'm working in like an advisory capacity. So if you are interested in bringing me on as an advisor, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn. Those are the two places that I post things about this. And I will wrap up there. I would love to hear what people are thinking about this and have a back and forth.
All right, fantastic. We're going to bring Tank up as well and remove your presentation. That was great. We have a lot of questions coming in, and so I don't envy Tank for having to sort of sort those. We might pick major themes if there's a lot of crossover. But let me get into a few things. I was going to sort of ask you a bit about your background, but just for time so we can reach these, I'm going to skip that. But suffice it to say, as Paul laid out, he's a real original in carbon removal. To be in this for 11 years is a long time. So you've seen a lot of these developments. So that should be taken into account from your perspective. I guess let me just start off with a couple things I'm sort of dying to. Like I understand the points that you're making specifically in this moment, but I'm kind of tempted to kind of make you think about this from a broader kind of historical lens, right? Mm-hmm. Like what you're identifying, what sounds like is sort of like critical, maybe even fatal sort of missteps that we should have taken, the other path in the fork in the road early.
Yeah.
To me, it seems when you look at all new industries as they develop, they have to be born somewhere to get footing. And they typically are born somewhat arbitrarily in things that they seem to look like, right? So the internet was originally regulated in a telecommunications framework, cars for horses and planes for rail. And they had to live there. And then once they started to be articulated in the real world, people were like, oh shit, this is something different. Therefore it goes. So for me, I'm wondering, isn't this just sort of a normal course of events? And where else would it have been born if not in that sort of offset market? So that's just question one.
I think that's a fantastic point. And I probably 99% agree with you on that perspective. And it does make sense. And as I was trying to point out throughout the presentation, like it makes sense. Like all the decisions made by people sort of made sense at the time. I think when I like titled that article, Carbon Removal's Wrong Turn, I was specifically thinking about that moment when Stripe decided, you know what, we're not going to do anything short term. We're only going to focus on long-term permanent removals. And I think that was a mistake. I think that, I understand why they did that, because at the time they were looking at it like, hey, we're just like a small fund at the time, and this is what we want to focus on, and other people will do different things. I don't think anyone could have predicted that would have morphed into the giant elephant in the room that was sucking all the oxygen out and saying like, okay, everyone's just following what you're doing. And that's where we have to go forward. So I think that, Chris, I think you make really smart points. And yes, things do often evolve to look like the thing that they were in the past, and that we've inherited a lot of challenges from the legacy offset market. But I do think that if we could like run an experiment over and do some time travel thing, like I would really like to see how differently things would have evolved if that advisory board had come back and said something a little bit different about what they were trying to do. They were trying to catalyze the permanent carbon removals. And I think that if we had zoomed out and said we were trying to catalyze a carbon removal industry for atmospheric impact, we would have done things a little bit differently.
Gotcha. So I'm just going to combine these two, that I'm going to shut up and have Tank pull up. But I think this is really important too. Again, we don't know where this is all going. If you look at major new industries that came and the intention or the expectation as to how they would behave in the world or what they would become, it's more often the case that we were flat out wrong at these early stages, right?
Totally.
I think one of the points that Andre brought up, I'll kind of merge it with another one. There's sort of two questions I want to ask. One is there sort of a category error, right? That we're thinking that this is a product we're ultimately going to sell, but more fundamentally, it's not a product. It's actually going back, one of the things that inspired me so much, Paul, was your amazing Nori podcast that you had. That was one of the things that really pushed me into carbon removal, hearing Klaus talk, hearing Julio Friedman talk. And I remember, this is the thing that Klaus is always talking about. It's like, it's ultimately a waste problem. It's not a widget or something like that people will buy. And to the extent that it has flash right now, we look at that as a chapter of early buyers that help get these real projects out in the world. People then understand them better. Maybe the price comes down a little bit more, but that's all really sort of a dress rehearsal for something that's ultimately going to have to be government led, just like waste treatment and sewage treatment. Yeah. And if we believe that's the case, you could pretend we're in the future and look back and say, okay, this is mostly driven by demand from governments because it's considered waste treatment. And the early actors in this were the ones who got it out into the world and laid some track around standards and certification, around models like procurement or AMCs that the government then, wound up sort of modeling after to really sort of take this to scale. And so that's kind of one thing I don't know if you kind of get the picture.
Yeah. No, I understand
if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, feedback heard. Andre, I think you're making a really smart point here. And one of my co-founders, Christoph Jospe, used to say all the time, if our car is driving around emitted like a purple gas coming out, and that was the carbon dioxide, like we would understand that this was a waste problem, and we wouldn't have gotten to this point. And you're right. We often spoke about this is just a garbage removal problem. I think we have multiple articles about that. I think you're also right, Andre, to point out this is a necessity, not a value creation. I think that, and I'm sort of coming up with this on the fly right now, but if phase one was it had to be, as you said, Chris, it had to be born out of something. I think that we're sort of near. I think we're at the end of phase one, and I'm arguing for phase two being something that goes beyond that into value creation, and then a phase 3 or 4 or whatever comes after it is getting to that point where it is a government led. It is like municipal waste, and it is integrated into everything. I just don't see that happening, like from a political standpoint, like a policy. It's not just the U.S., right? Like we see in countries in Europe like a pullback from climate commitments and stuff like that. So. Things are different now than they were 3 years ago. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. And going back to, this is a crisis and we have to start scaling today. And every year that we delay has a huge impact on the road. I think that we do need value creation integration as a next step while we continue to work towards integrating this as a,
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. And I do hope that through the work of Stripes and the Microsofts and the other supporters, they're starting to show the world a vision of carbon removal in which technology versus engineered just looks absurd. It doesn't even begin to tell the story of it. And a lot of those things that are popping up are highly value generating, which will, I think sort of justify a premium cost because they deliver other things in addition to carbon removal. And that's probably the next phase. What's the new sort of categories of carbon removal that are not trees versus machines, but rather highly specific things that integrate into other existing things? And that might give us our demand. Yeah,
that's right. But also recognizing like that's not going to get us to 10 billion tons either. Like there's not enough. There's not enough.
Yeah, but we have to be careful where.
Yeah,
I mean, I think when people started putting solar cells in calculators and on top of obscure pieces of infrastructure, that was the thing that took it to get to the next level where the cost went down that unlocked another market. Yep. If we kept saying from the very beginning and to labor under the burden of we need to have, however many terawatts of solar by this time, that in some ways is the biggest distraction. Let's just do the things that we know are needed to make things cheaper and more prolific in the real world and keep doing that again and again and again and again. And that's how we're going to get there. So anyway, I am going to hog the time here if I don't shut up, but I'm
Can I say one more thing about that real fast?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that as an industry, we have this tendency to navel gaze and focus on where we are today as the static form of how it always has to be. And to your point, what you just said, I think that we need to be constantly thinking about what is the next iteration of the carbon removal. Is we're going to be going on step functions. What's the next iteration? How do we evolve carbon removal next? And what I'm trying to push for right now is we need to be thinking about the next thing today.
Yep. I agree with you on that. All right, Pank, where do we start? We kind of usually do a sort of first come, first serve type of model here, but I'll leave it in your hands.
I think let's go to MRV. I think a lot of folks have their opinion around MRV.
I'm sure they do.
Mike Robinson, Mike said that discounting for uncertainty is a reasonable approach, but we do need enough MRV to know that removal is real and it is not a total fantasy. So otherwise we'd be spending a lot of time and money with zero impact. So that's one. And then to tie that in is that, it ultimately comes down to your example at Nori. It's around the cost of doing soil sampling. So one of the questions here, can find it exactly, but
which one was it? Who was it? Tank? I'll grab it.
It's ultimately around if the cost for soil sample, or I think it's Kim. Yes. Okay. So Kim just said that if the cost of soil sample were under a certain range, and you can get the quality for the samples, then would it be worth it then? So
yeah. And actually we let me read this.
Sorry, could have gotten that up early. A lot of questions.
Yeah. Okay. So we, before we shut down, we had announced a partnership with Perennial where we were doing we were building a new methodology, and Perennial is really, really cool technology, and they do soil sample testing, and they had figured out ways to kind of reduce the number of samples needed on a per acre basis, so that could reduce the cost. And we were modeling, we could basically make it work economically if we were selling at about $35 to $40 per ton. And we were projecting that we'd be able to do so and say that this is a more valuable product because we had added sampling. So I actually thought that we were on our way to doing that. And I think that that's a good thing. Technology will come down in price and will enable more precision in that way. My argument is not necessarily about whether or not to do that, because I think we should do that. My argument is the need for that, it's the thinking behind soil sampling equals good and precise and verified, so I'm safe to buy this, versus modeling is not safe to buy. That, I think, is an incorrect notion, and that's a limiting belief that sustainability teams hold. And that's holding us back from scaling on other methods that aren't as advanced technologically on the measurement side as soil carbon is. So I'm trying to address more the thinking behind that and not just the tech itself. And I'm really thrilled to see that soil sampling is coming down in cost. I think that's a good thing to happen.
Tank, do you mind if I insert myself with just one more statement linked to MRV? One of the other things, like if that future, let's say it goes in a direction where governments are primary drivers of demand, either directly through procurement or merging it with compliance regimes, I think that there's at least as good of a chance that that's going to happen as not. Then the very things that you're saying are that we've taken the wrong turns on around precise measurement and durability, those are likely to be prioritized even more by a government in terms of the way that they look at sort of taxpayer value and transparency. So if we look at this private sector thing as sort of a toy train version of what we ultimately want to happen at the public sector level, I think that the things that the public sector needs in order to proceed this in the public interest are probably a lot like where we started off with. But anyway, I broke my own rule there. Sorry. Go ahead, Tank.
All right, let's go to Christian's questions around moral hazard. So, you know, it essentially comes back to MRV2, right? How do you protect against moral hazard if you allow lower quality removals? This is saying that, you know, essentially, and then this is the way, sometimes the way I see it too, essentially there are three buckets. You have the avoidance credit, you have avoidance and reduction credits, and then you have sort of the lower permanence removal credits, and you have the high permanence or durable removal credits. So what's your thought on that?
Well, I think I would object to the notion of calling it lower quality, like temporary removals as lower quality. Like that's a big thrust of my argument here. I think that I wish that we could just get rid of the word quality when it comes to these these internal debates within the carbon removal industry. And yes, I understand the need to talk about quality generally when speaking to people outside, but we spend as an industry so much time navel gazing and debating what is high quality and low quality that we are stymieing the growth of scaling. And so I would very much object to the notion that a temporary removal is lower quality than a permanent removal, because I am trying to argue that scaling today is the thing that is most important. And so the more carbon that we can pull out of the atmosphere today, the better. And then we should just acknowledge, if it is a temporary removal, is part of the fast carbon cycle, meaning it's going to get released back to the atmosphere on some time scale that we might see in our lifetimes, then there are different ways that we can deal with that. We can just do more. We can renew it. We can also continue to do permanent removals in the background. A lot of this stems from the way in which we've built the industry around corporate carbon accounting. So Nick Van Ostel and Keep Cool wrote this great article after Running Tide shut down. And at the very end of it, he had this really nice concluding paragraph that says, we have to ask ourselves, are we building an industry that is helping large corporations manage their liabilities? Or are we trying to build an industry that is capable of removing gigatons of carbon? And it's pretty clear that we've been doing the former and not the latter. And I'm trying to say we should be moving towards that. So yes, that's a complex question that deserves a more complex, nuanced response. But part of the solutions that I'm trying to advocate for here are getting away from being solely dependent upon offtake budgets. Because when you are solely dependent on offtake budgets, these are important questions to answer, and it becomes very difficult to find a path forward for more temporary removals. But if we can find other sources of financing and who pays for this, then we can enable more investment into things that don't necessarily need that level of precision, because that precision is needed for risk management.
This was just Christian's sort of clarification a little bit. That was interesting what you just said, obviously, but here I think is the crux of his question, which is a good one.
It gets cut off after.
My question was not about quality of temporary removals, but rather the fact that they are cheaper than mitigating emissions, so create a moral hazard that permanent removals don't. And that I think is a very, very important and good point.
Sure. Yeah. And I would, in my perfect world, governments would be mandating emissions reductions. And separately, in fact, in the carbon removal's wrong turn article, I think I specifically said this, or like, if I were, running the whole planet, the way that I would do it is I would say, we should be reducing our emissions by like X% every year over some period of time, and let the market figure out how they're going to do that. And then we're also investing in different methods of removal, and we're treating them as separate things. Like, I think that the offsetting component is what makes this difficult. So I definitely agree with that, the fact that there's a moral hazard here, and I think that it requires different approaches. So is that going to happen? No, not anytime soon. So in the meantime, I think that cultural norms are the best ways to do that. So that, I don't know. I don't have a solution for that problem.
All right, Tank. Lot coming in.
Yeah, no, I like this Jack's question, Jack Sullivan. He said that he agrees that carbon credit revenues is insufficient to solve the problem, and I think this goes back to NASC's. He said, I also feel strongly that high value sequestration is available to us and needs innovation. So I think this goes back to what you were saying about Frontier also, is that a lot of times these buyers groups or these early buyers are really trying to kickstart sort of startup phase of carbon removal rather than the scale up phase of carbon, right? And so how do we, and it goes back to how do we fund this innovation research if it's not from early buyer VCM for carbon removal market anyways.
Great question. I think that's another thing that kind of fits into where I'm calling this like a wrong turn. Like, like if we make a slight change, I think philanthropic investment is the best way to support R&D like that, or it's built into budgets of companies that are trying to do like Mitsubishi really wants a lot of carbon removal projects going because they want to be a project developer. So that's a good thing, and that's where you can get that kind of budget coming in. I think that the mistake that we made was tying it to offsetting and corporate accounting. Like I'm really trying to posit that the ways in which we are doing corporate carbon accounting are now causing scaling problems. And so going back to the who pays, I've been thinking about this too. There's an article that I want to write about this somewhere. Like you've got three main ways that large scale things get financed. Government public financing, and you get the advantage of large scale and ostensibly public legitimacy. But you get the downside of really inflexible on what it can do and not agile or innovative at all. And it's usually going to be stuck in the past. Nonprofit financing, which doesn't really have as much scale and can also come with a lot of bureaucracy, but you can focus much more on impact than having to have some sort of ROI beyond that. And again, you get problems of agility and lack of innovation. And then you've got private financing, and you get all sorts of abilities to innovate and be agile and nimble, but it's quite fickle, and impact is usually quite secondary to some other sort of financial return. So there are positives and negatives to all three of these different methods. I think that we need something like a fourth method, and I don't really know what that looks like yet, but something that kind of combines the best of all of those and tries to mitigate the worst of all of them somehow. So like, how do we do R&D? I think it's probably government and nonprofit are the two that are more appropriate for that than trying to shoehorn it through corporate offsetting budgets. I totally understand that that's just kind of the way that it's evolved, and that's what we had to do. But I think that we should be, again, I'm just trying to get I really believe that there are like 50 people, 50 individuals who have an enormously outsized influence on the growth of this industry. And if I can reach like 25 of those people to think differently about this and think about the impacts of the decisions that they're making, like we're trying to break through a prisoner's dilemma problem here. And so I think that that's what I'm trying to do with this. So I just hope that we can think differently about new solutions.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to stop. And I absolutely admire your experience and your point of view. And I listen to you with great seriousness, Paul. And I'm really happy that you're stirring the pot here at a very critical moment, because we need to evolve. whether we debate about if it was a wrong turn or not, people who are on the inside of industry transformations were raising the alarm, but it was just, in retrospect, part of a sequence of things that led to another type of place. So we're all just walking with a flashlight here and trying to move forward. So really appreciate it. And we'll be a very regular reader of your excellent Substack, which we did link here. One thing I want to just put up here from Greg, who Greg Rao, a bit of a legend of CDR himself in Ocean CDR. This is absolutely true. I think is that we're maybe looking at some of the wrong customers.
Yes.
A limited number of them who have a certain logic of participation, where we're ignoring these pockets of demand that are all over the place. And so that's for another conversation, which we'll have a chapter of that coming up in a second. So I'm just going to tell people what's coming up next, then we'll adjourn. But Paul, I really want to thank, and let's not wait another 7 years to see each other face to face, man. I really, again, I'm a great admirer. So I will go ahead and let you go, Paul, and tell people what's coming up next. So one thing I'm really excited about, I just started a new job. I'm the carbon lead for the UN Climate Champions. So I'm very focused on COP. And one thing that's really been absent in this is CDR. It's been a lot of North America, a lot of Europe, a little bit of Asia, a little bit of Africa, but not enough focus on Latin America, and particularly some of the major economies in Latin America, namely Brazil. And so about once a month between now and COP, I'm going to be featuring things that at least have a Latin American focus to it, or maybe even specifically Brazil. So very excited to have the team from Net Zero on next week. We're going to talk about their very impressive and very real operations, not only in Brazil, but also in Cameroon, but they will focus on Brazil. So definitely join that if you can. And then the other one, which kind of goes along, in the spirit of what Greg, sort of closed this out with, is I've mentioned this before in the past, but Four Corners, which is a group that I started, we are launching the City CDR Purchasing Challenge, which uses the DOE Purchasing Challenges framework and finalists. And it's an effort to get small but prolific purchases from cities all over the United States. And so we're launching that, hopefully a soft launch by the end of next week. But by the 22nd, I'll be able to talk about that, run through the website, what we're trying to do, and hopefully enlist people wherever you may be, whether you're in a tiny town of Mayberry or you're in a global C40 city. We want to have as many different places as possible up there to start to establish the local as a demand driver. So hopefully people can join us then. Paul, stick on for a second if you have a minute once we shut down. But with that, I will let you guys go, and we'll see you next week. But thanks, everybody, for joining. Great conversation.